Hello, hi guys, can you hear me well? I hope
Yes, we can. It just takes ages to unmute.
Okay, thanks, Carsten.
This is my mic test. Your
We
mic
can
is
hear you.
fine.
Yeah,
Yeah, a bit quiet, but perfect. Otherwise,
perfect. So let's wait a couple of minutes and then we will start. Thanks. Hi, Juan Carlos.
I was having issues with the Mythical. Hi, everyone.
Hi. We were waiting for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we can probably start, right?
Yes. Just go ahead.
Okay, so this is the interim meeting for IETF MAC address device identification for network application services, MADINAS. And this is Carlos Bernardos from UC3M and my co-chair Juan Carlos Zúñiga, Cisco. As usual, the typical reminders. This session is probably being recorded. I'm not sure. I guess so. The interims are also recorded, but I don't know, to be honest. The note well that I guess you are all familiar, but in case you are not familiar, please read it carefully, read it well for your own understanding. And then I think we have some interim meeting tips using Mitico. I think at this point we are all familiar with Mitico, but in any case, make sure your audio and video are off unless you are presenting or asking questions. And usually using a headset is strongly recommended to avoid any echoes and this type of things. In terms of resources, we have the agenda that is very, very simple in this case, in the sense that we are concentrated on the BCP document, although we will also have an update from IEEE that we think is very useful for Madinas, but the main discussion will be the BCP document. Some reminders, minutes are taken, and this is a good point because we need to find some guy that help us taking the minutes. So is there any volunteer to collaboratively join the notes and help us in getting the minutes? Okay, Michael, Mitico is recorded, perfect. I'll try to take some notes, but I will appreciate if somebody else can also help us in taking notes. No volunteers. Remember that this is important.
And I'll take some notes to help.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. Well, you see that the URL that is on the slide is from the past meeting. I think you can access the right link in the data tracker, but I will put it already. You put it already, Juan Carlos. Okay, perfect. In the chat. And well, you can also join the chat room, but I think, well, probably we are all here in the Mitico. Oh, sorry, in the Mitico room. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong button. So then the agenda, the welcome, this is it. Then the BCP discussion, we will have presentation from the both author teams of the two candidate documents that we have at this point. Draft Henry Madinas BCP Network RCM and Draft Richardson Madinas BCP. We hope that as a result of this discussion, we will try to have a good plan on how to move forward on this charter item, which is the main, the remaining one that we don't have an adopted document at this point for the set of 3 that we agreed in the Madinas Charter. And then at the end, we have a short IEEE status update from Mark. And then some close or short next steps summary from us. And okay, I think
maybe
this is
just
it.
one
Yeah.
point there, Carlos, if you don't
Yes.
mind. We'll hear from Mark the status update of 8.11 BH especially, and it has to do with some of the discussions we were having about the identifiers and the way it works. So I think it'll be good to have this as a wrap up to understand how we can collaborate with IEEE. But I just wanted to say it now because the topic may come up during the BCP part. But just bear in mind that we will have also 10 minutes to discuss specifically about that identification part at the end with IEEE, and then we'll have some more minutes to discuss how we want to move forward. So something to bear in mind.
Okay, thanks. So I guess we can go directly to the BCP discussion. So Jerome, Amelia, who is going to present?
Good morning. I can present.
Okay, perfect. Do you want me to?
Share the slide because every time I try it, it takes 10 minutes.
Okay, I can share the slides, and then I can even let me see. Why don't your slides are not here? Let me 1 second because I loaded there before.
Oh, thank you.
So it should be.
Maybe we need to update.
I did it, so I don't know why I cannot because I did it before. So it's here. Let me try another time.
Do you want me to try?
You can try if you want. I mean I already updated, but anyway, if you are doing it.
No, indeed, I only see 3.
3 slides.
I
Yeah,
don't see 0.
And sharing them will take longer than presenting them.
Wait, let me try the old way.
I think I just forced it. It should be there now. Can you guys check? Maybe Jerome, you want to take a look?
Okay, I have it now. Yeah. So.
All right,
okay.
beautiful. Thank you. That's working. So thank you and good. So good morning again, everybody. So I'm Jerome, one of the 2 co-authors of that BCP. So there are 2 of them. That's why I'm saying one of them. Next slide, please. You may remember. Let me see if I can. Yeah, thank you. That's in the last meeting we were discussing moving out of the use case document some of the elements, namely section 7, to push it into. Thank you, Carlos. To a BCP document. So Emilia and I did that, and so the goal of the initial push out was to do two things. One of them is to redefine in the context of the BCP where RCM was used, and that's borrowing a lot from the use case document where we define all these different elements, which are the various places like home, the managed residential, the enterprise, all these environments, and summarize there what the expected practice of RCM is to be. So, for example, home, most of the time you trust the others users to see your Mac, but you may be seen from the outside, and therefore RCM may be there. In an MDM type of environment, the enterprise need to track devices. They are not concerned too much about privacy because those are enterprise devices, etc. So in this first part of this document, we summarize those discussions that we had, throughout different meetings, and then what we simply did was to push out into this document as a second part, that section 7. So you may remember that section 7 was, showing how WPA2 v3 can protect some of the data payload over the wireless link, but not the MAC address itself. How things like .1x can allow for the authentication of the machine or the user, which in an RCM context may be sufficient, to assert the identity of the device that's connecting. We also were discussing how open roaming could be useful in public venues, especially as it allows for obfuscation of the identity to the local venue, but still identification of the user, which could be nice in an RCM context. So that's the skeleton of this document. But as we were discussing this document in the previous meeting, as you know, Michael, who's probably going to spend more of a meeting time there, also started doing some more extensive work, proposing as well a BCP. So since then we met, Michael, Amelia, and myself, and discussed a little bit, some directions that I think Michael is going to share. So I think for this particular draft, the first step will be to try to study, the direction of unification with Michael's document on one hand, and then at the same time, now that we have extracted out from the use case document, section 7, it seems that it could be valuable to let the BCP take shape a little bit, because that would probably bring us to maybe add a little bit or reformulate a few things in this use case framework document. So maybe for the next few months do that, so that it gets to a final stage that then we can adopt. So that's where we are with these documents. I'm open, of course, for any question. I'm not sure you guys would have any until you heard what Michael has done, but if you have any now or later, please feel free to ask them. Hearing none, as we say elsewhere, so back to you, chairs.
Thanks, Jerome. So I guess we can move now to Michael. Michael, would you like to take it on? Okay.
Yeah. So you need to give me permission to share my slide, share the slides. Here we go. I think that's the right one. Yep. So my intention is to have a lot of conversation. So I would suggest, given the few number of people in the room, that you just unmute yourself without asking and jump in. So we have a bunch of charter items that we're supposed to work on. So we have 3 points here: identity network and application services, and examining the effect of RCM schemes on them. Analyzing various existing identities beyond the MAC address that can be used. I don't really know that there are any, but I think that somewhere we need to talk about that. And I think number 3 is interesting. The best kind of identity is one you don't need. Then it says we're going to produce a BCP, recommending the means to reduce the impact of RCMP in the documented use cases. So that implies we better have some documented use cases and to mitigate. And that the privacy achieved with RCM is not compromised. So that means that introducing some other long-term identifier that everyone can see is not actually very useful. And I have some concerns about some proposals, but I don't have a lot of details at this point.
So Michael, since you asked to
Yep.
jump in, sorry for getting in.
Yep.
On number 2, that's part of what we will hear from Mark's presentation. Just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, I realize that.
Good.
So one thing that I think that we haven't been clear on up to date is that there's actually 2 sets of activities. There's pre-association when the stations, as they're called, and the end nodes as we think of them, look for a network to join, and they can do this actively or passively. Obviously, if they do it passively, then they don't necessarily have to reveal who they are. On the other hand, they may have to wait seconds to minutes in order to hear about the new network. And so that may not be so pleasurable for many devices. And so they tend to probe, and they have to probe with a specific MAC address. And it's been suggested in various places that that MAC address should be completely random and maybe even completely different than the one that's used to bring up an association. And there were some documents and some comments, or I guess some verbal comments I received that from, kind of hearsay, that not all the chipsets can actually change their pre-association versus association MAC address without essentially creating a new association, right? So you have to reinitialize them to do that. And maybe that's okay, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But the point is that we need a policy for both pre-association and association things. So it may be that there's ways of discovering that, in fact, this is a network that you feel secure with. And if you're in that place, then you're perfectly happy to use a more trackable address. But on the other hand, discovering whether or not you're in that network or not may in fact be a risky approach if you're going to ask questions. So you may always want to do pre-association. So we had all these terminology that I proposed about how often you change your MAC address, whether it's never to, every 12 hours or something. And we probably need to add some language that says, that talks about pre-association, association, and that what kind of policies we want on each, and whether they're linkable or not. So I think that's an important thing to add to the conversation as we go forward. So this is how I see the 3 documents going together. So one is that I think that at least one of the 2 documents that are adopted right now, actually they have very similar names. One of which says use cases and requirements. And I think that we need to drop the words requirements from that document and probably change the title a little bit so the 2 documents are a little more clear that they're different. So in my mind, the first document, which is use cases, needs to detail a bunch of things about how static MAC addresses have been used to provide some service X, call it. Amelia has been, and some others have been working at the IEEE and have a document which I understand is a bit stuck at this point. And I want to move my camera that way. There we go. And it actually details a bunch of things that I didn't know about, which was very interesting. For instance, I'll talk about the next slide, airport security queue length, and different uses of this. And then in my mind, the RCM document needs to then go through these use cases, and essentially for each policy that the device could adopt, and remembering that the devices are adopting these policies independently of the use case. So the device has a particular policy. It may be per network if it can figure that out, but then the pre-association part is how does it determine what network it's on. Sometimes devices also use GPS or something like this to determine where they are as to whether they feel safe, and essentially to look at the impact of the different policies on that application. So in some cases, it just has no effect. I mean, it doesn't matter. In other cases, it's completely failure of the service. And then the BCP document needs to then say, okay, how can we change the network, the way that the service is actually used or operated, such that the different policies now either do not materially affect how the service works, or maybe in some cases they are able to, there's a collaboration and the two ends figure out what to do. I posted an email about this, and I guess I received a fair number of plus ones, a bunch of them unicast, because people didn't want to disrupt the conversation. But I'm another slide about this, explaining it in more detail, but I'm interested to hear people's reaction to this division of text.
At least from my side, that there's I agree with the flow of starting from use cases. I think we have to explain the different policies. I think that is actually great and a good advance. We need to define the requirements so that we can clearly see if the BCP responds to those requirements, right? So we are deriving.
I don't know what a requirement here would mean. A requirement for a, let me advance the slide maybe. Okay. Would the requirement be about the airport queue sizing problem, or requirement of randomized MAC address, or?
Let's say that we have a use case where we have a higher degree of security, and then because it's a managed network, and then we do need to identify the user to allow him into the network.
But
we say, okay, that's.
But when I walk past the airport, I'm not part of their network. They could have a high needed for security on their network, but that's
correct.
no
So you are
effect on
not.
me.
So you are not part of that use case, and therefore that requirement doesn't apply to you.
But that's the airport queue sizing thing. They're trying to figure out whether I'm in the queue or not. So the whole purpose of the service, the whole purpose of the service is to inform people which queue is shorter, right? To know that, you have to know how many people are in the queue, but the people in the queue are not participating consciously in the service. They're being observed passively, right?
Yeah, but we're talking about two different use cases here. That's
well, I'm asking you, what are these requirements that you're talking about? Where do they apply? You said it applies to a use case, but like, what are the I don't understand the requirement statement here, right?
Okay,
we're not defining the airport queue problem, right?
Well, let me try again, and then let me finish, and
okay.
then we'll see, because I started describing a use case, and then you started changing the use case. So that's probably where we're not getting together. So my use case is on a managed network, let's say an enterprise network, high security, where you need to identify the user to join that network. Then you can derive a high requirement to identify the user to join that network. So, however, if there's next to it, there's another network that it's public, and that does not require a high level of security and has no interest whatsoever to identify the user, but just has to know how many users are there, then the requirement would not apply to that use case. So that's what I'm saying. Like,
I don't think of those as being. I don't think of those what you just described as being use cases. Those are just networks, right? They have some requirements, and they have some credentials required, and they're going to go do their thing.
Not so sure. I mean, what do you call a use case then?
Places where MAC addresses are being used, possibly without the knowledge of the end users, to do things. Right? Amelia.
So that's very generic, right? So Amelia has joined the queue. I think we're not doing this in a very orderly way, but Amelia, do you want to?
I don't want it in an orderly way, because otherwise we won't have a conversation, right? Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, So this was one of the discussions that we were having in the previous couple of weeks between me, Jerome, and Michael, how exactly to define the use cases, because we currently have a set of use cases, use case descriptions in existing Madinas documents, namely the use cases document, draft Madinas use cases document. But then we also have the use cases as defined in the IEEE 802.11 task group structures. And I would say that the current approach chosen in the Madinas group here is more high level. So it tries to abstract the use cases, and that might be good as kind of high level categorization of the more granular use cases that have been described by .11. However, I would like to introduce as a potentially complicating point for developing best current practices for the total set of use cases identified in the .11 task groups, which is if you're thinking about this as a privacy or personal data control issue, it may be the case that a network service provider does not have and should not have the right to use a MAC address by any technical means for the purpose of tracking an individual who explicitly doesn't want to be tracked. So it might not be an obligation on an end user, as it were, to have their grocery store path tracked using a MAC address or any equivalent means. It might be that in order for such tracking to occur, you need some form of consent or optional mechanism that the end user can approve through their device. And so I think we also need to reflect on, regardless of how we structure the best current practices document in terms of use case hierarchies, policy descriptions for how MAC addresses are randomly changed, we might want to reflect on, do we want to have real life proof of any of these policies being deployed in practice? For instance, do we know that there is a per boot MAC address change policy out there in the wild? Has anyone seen a per session MAC address change policy in practice? Do we know of any grocery store path tracking occurring? Like, do we want to have this like realistic? Do we want to have evidence that the use cases that we're bringing up and the policies that we're addressing exist for real? So that is one thing. But I think we also need to deal with this. What do we include in our best current practices things which abjectly defy potentially the preferences of end users? And so I guess that's my contribution.
So to give an example, I think of the kind of consent, non-consent, or what's in it for me kind of discussion. The pre-association arrival, some of that, and there's a bunch of different things mixed into that thing, but one of them is apparently where when the device sends out their probe packet, only the access point that hears it with the highest signal level answers, with the idea that the device is steered to what they hope is the best capacity access point. Of course, that then requires that the pre-association and the association address be the same. And it clearly is the user has some potential consent there, because they may say, oh yes, for this network I want to do this kind of thing, and I have a relationship with that network, and I'm happy to do that, right? But the exact same pattern is occurring in the grocery store and airport queue sizing thing, where in fact all they're really doing is counting how many people are heard by each access point, and there's no consent involved, right? There's the user's not even connecting to that network, right? They're simply being observed to be in that location. You?
Okay, you? Yeah.
Yeah. Am I saying your name right? I hope. Go ahead, just jump in. Your hand up.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm just purely coming from operator point of view. So today you look at the use cases, and most of the use cases will, in the end, about the trust level. And when you look at the trust level today, at least, I mean, it could be in the future, things like we will have more technology that available for us to do. But at least like from today, what we look at it, you have WPA PSK, you have WPA Enterprise. Sometimes you may have WPA web portals. And this is the way that now the standard way to get on the network. And from the use case perspective, at least, like these are the way that we get into the network. And when the vendorizations now, the map vendorization now get into the picture, my suggestions like for the working group to look at it is how we are going to how we're going to define the requirement to map the use case to the trust level. So in this case, the trust level could be like what you said, I trust this network, and how we can identify the network that is like beyond the scope at this point. We're not talking about this, but then if let's say I'm in an office building, and this is now the work machine that I connect to the network, there will be a set of requirements that we need to satisfy. We need to define this. We need to define in order to have a BCP to map to the requirement. So my suggestion is there any way that we will be able to at least separate or define the use cases by the trust level, and then by the trust level, then we map the technology to that trust level, say, okay, with this trust level, this technology you can use.
And you mean the trust of the user in the network, or do you mean the trust of the network and the user?
I will say mutual. I mean, we probably need a way that to say, yeah, you as a client, you trust this network, and then you will know that this is for sure the network that I'm joining. At the same time, the network, and we have a lot of technology today, we can tell that the network will authenticate the user before the network let the user to join.
Right. And I think that we also have a chicken and egg problem, where you might be willing to reveal your identity to the network if you were sure it was the correct network, but you can't know it's the correct network until you reveal your identity to the network, or an identity to the network, right? And I think the other side is that we do not have a way of a priori signaling from the network to the user what level of identity we expect. So the user has to basically pick one, or their operating system has to have a good default, is probably more likely.
But that is good. And I mean, Michael, sorry,
Yeah.
I mean, that is good. I mean, what you're saying in this case is that maybe now become one of the requirements for to satisfy whatever use case we define. Then there will be a requirement.
Right. The reason that the part that's bothering me about when you say requirement to satisfy the use case is the part that I'm having a problem with, is that in many cases the user is not involved in the use case, right? So for the example, the last point, customer support and troubleshooting, right? Why isn't my iPhone getting on my home network? And they call up the customer service, and the customer service gets some list of MAC addresses. Today they get a list of MAC addresses through TR79 of what the home router is, and they're able to look and go, oh, this one's an Apple device because of the prefix, and it seems to keep trying to connect, but it's clearly got the wrong password. And the person says, oh, well, okay, they figure it out, right? So in that context, the user hasn't necessarily consented to a use case that involves the home router tracking them by their PVOM, right? Which is their, the OUI provided address, which would actually be the best scenario, right? But they haven't participated consciously in saying, oh, the requirement for me to now get customer support is that when I'm on my home network, I don't hide my vendor ID, so they can figure out and help me, right? Do you understand what I'm saying?
So that
I don't follow though. I'm sorry. Yeah, JC, if you want to go.
No, well, I'm just saying that for that specific use case, I can see the description of the use case and the requirement as you just described. That's what I meant before by use case, then derived requirements. Like if you say you cannot hide, I'm not agreeing with it. I'm just saying that's a requirement I would derive from that use case. You cannot hide your OUI.
Exactly. Exactly. That is
Okay.
the point.
So that's a,
Yeah.
so you're saying the use cases are deriving a requirement for identity. I'm going to say disclosure, in order for them to work. So the
I would
airport
say the
queuing
use
device
case-
doesn't care whether you have an iPhone or a BlackBerry or a random address, as long as you keep it for the next hour.
So the
Whereas
use case for me is just like you can, I mean, like what you said, I mean, we can debate in the mailing saying that this is the right use case or not, but that's exactly, you just write down use case, and this is the use case, and in order to satisfy this use case, this will be the requirement.
Yeah,
Okay,
and then
I
let's
can
say
buy
the
that. If
requirement
that's what that
is,
means, then I can buy that terminology. It's not how
yeah,
it's not the term I would have used, because I think it's confusing, but because the way that we write requirements down in the IETF is sometimes more in the
in the must
architectural
or
kind of view, right? Whereas this is and therefore blah blah blah, we need this, right? That makes sense to me to do that way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think now I know your concern here. Yes, this is not the like RFC type standard track requirement at this point. It's more like just the use case high level requirement.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
exactly.
cool. I
think,
totally agree with that. Let's do that. Mark, you've had your hand up for a while.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like it's working. Good. Good. Thanks for having me. The one thing that we ran into in the IEEE, which might be a helpful kind of path already been down for you guys, is as we were starting to list out these requirements, we discovered that kind of each of them was a different, let me call it dimension, for lack of a better word, around this question of what information is shared and to whom. You know, this, I think you came to a lot of that already, actually, in the conversation you just had, but I think it's helpful to actually consciously think of it that way. A question of when we say, is the user being tracked? Well, okay, but are they being tracked knowing who they are, or are they being tracked but they're anonymous? But I can tell that it is a device or a person, probably a device, doing something over time, like walking through the grocery store, but I have no idea who they are. That's different than understanding, right, who the person actually is and tracking them through some scenario. And then the question of, is it a tracking that can possibly be done or snooped by a third party, or only information that the network itself, that the user has granted some permission, can figure out and can use, and is hidden from.
Also, I think that if random third parties can do it, then no matter what the bona fides or the trust that the network that people have in the network operator is, if third parties can do it, then there's sort of a different level of concern.
Agreed, but that's why I'm saying, so we drew out all these different dimensions, and another dimension is time. So for example, let's say, yes, I can be tracked, but while I'm being tracked, I'm anonymous. You don't know it's me. You just know it's some device that is walking through the grocery store. And by the way, you can only track me for 5 minutes, 30 seconds, pick something, before you lose track of
duration
me.
of your randomized pre-association MAC address, right?
So there's a duration factor, there's an amount of information exposed factor, right? All these different, like I say, dimensions to the question. So you come back around to, well, actually, is it a concern that a third party can track me if they have no idea who I am and they can only do it for 30 seconds? Do I care? You know, I don't know, but it really helps to divide these things into these different measurements, different dimensions, to then be able to bucketize them into which ones are really a concern, or what level of concern are they, and then think about the requirements you have for solving that particular problem.
So jumping up a level here back to what's on this slide, this was intending to kind of illustrate what the different documents would contain. So first of all, we describe the use case. When you describe it independently of RCM, what's happening today, how our MAC address is being used in a particular application or situation, the IEEE, this IEEE document that Amelia was working on, and I think a few others, has actually a lot of interesting stuff in places that I didn't even know that was happening. Airport queue sizing was a surprise to me, but totally makes sense when I think about it. And then, as you said, several said, so that leads to a requirement that the MAC address be trackable or constant for, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or that the user knows about it, or something like this, right? And then the RCM document, the idea is that it then says for each one of these use cases or categories of use cases, if we wind up with categories, what is the effect on that application or use case when different randomization policies are used, right? So in this case, in the airport queue or the grocery store tracking, if you randomize your MAC address with some frequency, more than, say, every hour, okay, then what happens is you wind up with the belief that there's more people in the airport, security queue than actually are there, right? And if you are just every pre-association, for instance, if that was a new random MAC address, for example, and that's how you were counting, that might wind up with a fairly large wrong out, and things wouldn't work. Amelia.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I'm wondering if in this meeting our time is best spent on discussing the potential peculiarities of each use case that has previously been investigated by or if
I'm just trying to motivate what's happening here. I don't want to go into details. Don't want to argue about that point. I'm sorry if I come back to it.
I would like to come back to this thing that Jerome also mentioned when he was presenting his slides, which is, do we have a sort of envisaged path or preferential path forward for merging or joining up the current BCP proposals, and how we could potentially structure a best current practices document that would be helpful to network operators or mobile OS vendors. And I was wondering if you had any time to think about whether you believe, Michael, that some merging of the BCP proposals is possible, and how that might occur in practice. Thank you.
I didn't get a chance to read your document until last week. I didn't know it existed even, and I did read it, and I don't see any problem with us eventually merging. I don't have any strong feelings. I can just throw mine away and send you text. That's fine with me. That's really, you're talking about next steps anyway.
Okay, so actually, maybe we are 2 minutes early for the next point, but since I think it'll nourish the discussion, why don't we just move to Mark's presentation so that we see also the IEEE side, and then we talk about next steps. Mark, would you like to share the slides? Oh, perfect.
So my apologies. I'm new to this tool and trying to figure this out. Interesting. No, I'm getting a big red X. What does that mean? If I say share.
Do you want to share your slides, your screen, or do you want to share slides? There we go. That I've already.
I was trying to share a slide deck that I've got open here, but I gather it doesn't work that way. Sorry that I'm new to this.
Share screen, not share slide deck.
There we go. Is that working?
Yes.
We see it now.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So first off, just a couple of caveats. I'll point out that per the IEEE rules, I am actually the chair of the TGBH working group or task group that's working on this stuff inside of .11, but I am not here representing that group. I'm here as a personal individual. So these are my opinions. That's an IEEE rule that I have to make that clear. But I'll try to get through that fairly quickly. Where's the next slide button? There we go. Okay. So in the IEEE, as we started looking at all of these privacy questions and randomized MAC address impact questions, we realized that there's kind of two different major tracks, and we have actually split the work into two projects. The task group BH, which is the one that I chair, is focused specifically on, we know that there are devices in the world that are using randomized MAC addresses now and are doing it obviously for privacy reasons, but we actually don't care why they're doing it. The fact is they're doing it. And given what they're doing, they are quote unquote breaking some use cases or some facilities that are part of .11. And we are looking at very reactively, how do we respond to the fact that this is happening? And what do we want to do or need to do to bring back facilities that used to work when MAC addresses were stable and have those facilities still work, but without causing any new kind of stable identity to be leaked. So I think we have a very similar scope to the scope slide that I was just seeing that I think you guys are working on. And at a very high level, just to let you know, TGBH is just about done with our first draft 1.0. I'm hoping, in fact, that at our face-to-face meeting next week, that we will have an agreement for that draft to be our first working draft. The separate group that's going on is called TGBI, and that's a separate activity, but happening in parallel. And they have tackled the kind of much broader scope of sort of everything else. So what else is going on that's leaking personal information and can result in tracking and other such things? Within the 802.11 scope, which is a bit narrow, so it's another challenge that we have, what can be done or what should be done to protect that information? They've got a much longer schedule and they're still pretty early in their process. They've got a lot of things written down and a lot of interesting conversations, but I think they're a long way from anything that resembles a draft. It's much more discussion still at this point. So I'm going to focus for the rest of this pretty much on the TGBH stuff. One, because I'm obviously closer and more familiar, but also because it's more mature and coming along and I think has a more direct impact and connection to this group. Within TGBH in that draft 1.0 that I was just describing that I hope will get out next week, we've basically split the mechanisms that we're looking at. And like I said, we're being very reactive. So we are in fact at the point of saying, what are the mechanisms we can create and invent within 802.11 to solve the problem? So we've moved past the use cases and identifying requirements and things, and we're now looking at what are the actual solutions. So actually, let me pause here. I didn't put it in this deck and probably should have in hindsight after this conversation, but clearly if there's anything we can do to collaborate on the path we've been down to identify those use cases, turn those into, I hesitate to use the word requirements, but to turn them into some reaction to the specific use cases and breaking it down, like I said earlier, trying to figure out the dimensions of the problem and so forth. If any of that background material is helpful, that would be a really good place to collaborate. But we within the group have kind of moved past that, like I say, to solutions. So all of that, I think, is a good place for us to be collaborating between these two groups. In the solution space, I'll jump to that though. We've come up with two large buckets, if you will, or categories for the solutions. One of them is this concept of what's called, the name doesn't really mean anything, but called a device ID, just so you've got a handle to hang on it. This is a case where the network itself allocates some identifier to a device. It can do that either after it has done some real type of security negotiation, 1x or something like that, and does in fact know who the user is, or up to the network. If it doesn't care that much, it can allocate an identifier much more randomly, but just give the device some identifier that will be stable for an interesting period of time. It's up to the network what it wants to do and what this information means. There's that information then is communicated down to the device only inside of a secured communication. So it's part of the encryption exchange while security negotiation is going on. So there's no ability for a third party to understand or track this ID or even see it. So again, kind of in either of those cases, the ID might mean something real with a real user, or it might just be a random thing, but it doesn't matter because third parties can't see it anyway. There are a few places where you might transmit that identifier in a way that might be in the clear. For example, some pre-association behaviors. So we actually have an optional mechanism where the identifier itself can be turned into an opaque blob. And only that opaque blob is sent back and forth. So once again, to protect from third parties being able to track it. The second choice is to make the MAC address that the device is using, in fact, be identifiable. And I realized I didn't capture one bullet here that I probably should have, which is that the fundamental concept here is that the device and the network at some point do actually associate and have a secured tunnel in which they can communicate. And the device will tell the network, the next time you see me, this is the MAC address that I'm going to use. So the device allocates a randomized address more or less like it does today. It's going to use that address for its transmissions, but it's going to use it for its transmissions at some future time talking to the network. And presumably the network knows who that device is while it's doing this because it told it on the previous connection. If you get me, this is kind of a chain of events, right? That once the network has established that it understands the device a first time through some hopefully secured mechanism, then from then on, you can follow this daisy chain of saying, okay, when I see some random address in the future, I will know that that's that same device. So this allows the device to use that MAC address as its way of communicating, which makes it much easier to provide the information. The information can be provided pre-association through its use of MAC address that it uses when it's probing, those sorts of things. Again, up to the control of the device, how frequently it wants to rotate that, and how, for example, which kinds of probes it might use that recognizable MAC address. So for example, one of the behaviors that we do know about, make sure you guys are aware of, is a lot of the devices that are out there today are using a completely randomized MAC address when they are just scanning around looking for a network. And that address is in fact being randomized very quickly, probably almost on every scan. It will pick a different address. So there's no ability to track the device over time, let alone have any clue what device identity that actually is. But once the device decides that there is a network of interest and is planning to attach to that network, then it might send its probes using this identifiable MAC address so that the network can say, oh, okay, I recognize that this is a device that's going to attach. It's one I do understand and know about, a user coming home to their home network, for example, and can then take the appropriate pre-association actions to help the device get onto the network. Whether or not it uses that same MAC address once it's attached is kind of a separate question. The device can rotate that address kind of, again, at its discretion. So both of these schemes result in being able to identify the client, certainly while it's associated, but also for some pre-association schemes using the different mechanisms that I very highly level described, and based on work that was done in 802.11az, which is creating an authentication and secure mechanism for exchanging some limited amounts of information pre-association. So we're leveraging that same work, and that was actually done for ranging activities. Device location activities was the key that AZ was working on, but we're trying to leverage their work. And I know I need to hurry up. So anyway, just to give you an idea where we are and what I think our next steps ought to be between the groups, my personal opinion anyway. Like I said, TGBH is looking at targeting a draft 1.0 out of the meeting next week. We're hopeful. The rest of the list here of our plan is somewhat optimistic, but I don't think it's too far off. That we're hoping we'll do a working group letter ballot between May and July meetings of IEEE. And assuming we can get some success level out of that, then I think it would be appropriate for us to share the actual draft. And Dorothy Stanley, the chair of .11, has been in contact with myself and the chairs here with some mechanisms and things that we can use to share this information and to share the draft, because IEEE drafts are actually copyrighted and kept private, but we can share it with the Madinas folks here. And just a couple of references at the back. I think you guys are aware of these, but especially that issues tracking document, the first reference there. I think that's the one that has been referenced on this call, but if not, that I think is an interesting, useful document where we went through and down this path of trying to identify use cases and the implications of the use cases. We also had to take the further step of which of these are within .11's scope. And so several of them we punted and said, yeah, that's an interesting problem, but it's not our problem to solve. But some of them we said are within our scope to solve, and that's what we're attempting to do within our draft. So that's kind of where we are. And going back, my recommendations are that we do start trying to share this work with IETF. And I would say as soon as we can, and I will work with Dorothy and the chairs here and figure out how we can start to share our drafts as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, just to close on that, I agree. I think it makes complete sense to share the draft, especially if something comes out next week from the IEEE 802.11 meeting in Orlando. And yeah, we will also do whatever is needed so that people in Madinas can get access to that document. And so that is our next step. That is, I think we can assume it's happening. For the liaison, I guess we'll see if it's needed or how much need we have for a formal liaison. For now, what you just gave to Madinas is very useful, and I'm pretty sure it's will be appreciated. So of course, if in the future you can provide an update, it'll be great. If we need to design someone specifically to do the liaison, we can do that. I don't think we in IETF we require such a formality. What the level of details you provided, it's super good. But we can work that out if it's needed, especially from the IEEE side. And then I guess the question is also, there's a lot of food for thought now about how to advance for next steps from both groups. I'm not sure we will reach a conclusion in 2 minutes. Probably we will continue the discussion on the mailing list, but for now, the last 2 minutes, I would just like to open the mic to hear people's reaction to the presentations after what we just heard, the proposal for the documents, the way 11BH is trying to work out the identifiers and how we can work together. Does anybody have any quick reaction to that? All right, so hearing none, and since we're almost out of time, probably the best would be to continue discussion on the mailing list, also because the audience today is limited. It's pretty core to the ones that are participating and working in Madinas, but probably better to continue on the mailing list so that more people understand where we are and what our next steps. So looking forward to hearing updates from, first of all, from the BCP side. If you guys have any thoughts on how to work together, and probably you guys want to ask the questions that you were asking on the mailing list. And likewise, I think on the IEEE 802.11 side, any updates, we can first pass them on the mailing list and then see how we can formalize that. All right. So we're out of time, but thanks everyone. This is being very useful. Any last remark, Carlos?
No, from my side. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thanks everyone. Talk to you soon.